Savannah Guthrie said it herself. Not a reporter, not an investigator, not a profiler with decades of experience behind them. Her own daughter, sitting across from her best friend on national television, voice breaking, eyes filling, hands that would not stop moving. She said the thing no daughter should ever have to say out loud. That she feared she brought this to her mother's doorstep. That the person who came in the dark on January 31st was not looking for an 84-year-old woman living quietly in the desert. They were looking for her. And her mother, gentle, faithful, private Nancy, the woman who raised her alone, who went to church every Sunday, who watered her garden and had dinner with her daughter and went to bed without a single reason to be afraid, was simply the door that could be opened. Former FBI profilers now believe investigators may have missed that possibility from the very beginning. And it starts and ends with one name: Savannah. Before we go any further, subscribe right now and turn on every notification. What these former FBI profilers revealed about this case is unlike anything that has come out in 3 months, and you need to be here when the next update drops. Now, stay with me, because what these profilers revealed about who took Nancy, why they took her, and how long they had been watching before they ever made their move, is the most devastating development this case has seen in 3 months. For 3 months, the world chased the wrong answer. Bitcoin wallets, ransom deadlines, cryptocurrency trails that dissolved into nothing. Investigators poured resources into a financial motive that felt logical on the surface: a famous family, a vulnerable target, a demand for money. It made sense. Until it didn't. On April 30th, 2 men who spent their careers studying the darkest corners of the human mind sat down with Brian Entin, James Fitzgerald, Jim Clemente. These are not commentators. These are men who built their careers inside the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Men who interviewed violent offenders, studied criminal escalation, and built psychological profiles used in some of the most difficult investigations in American history. When they looked at the Nancy Guthrie case, both arrived at the same conclusion, independently, without comparing notes beforehand. This was never about money, and Nancy was never the true target. To target Nancy Guthrie, someone needed detailed knowledge that had nothing to do with her. Not the casual familiarity millions of viewers have with Savannah from television, something far more focused, far more deliberate. They knew where Savannah's mother lived. A quiet residential neighborhood in Tucson. Not a place connected to Savannah's public life in any obvious way. Not a place you find by Googling her name. Not a place that appears in any interview or profile about her career. You find that place by looking. Specifically, over time, they knew Nancy's routines, when the house went quiet, when the lights went out, when she was alone and when she was not. The kind of knowledge that does not come from a single drive-by. It comes from sustained, patient observation. Watching the same house across multiple days, multiple weeks. Learning the rhythms of someone's life until those rhythms feel familiar. Retired FBI profiler Raymond Carr called it a stalking-type progression, and that phrase is important. Because stalking-type progressions follow a documented pattern that investigators have seen repeat across decades of cases. It starts small. So small that almost nobody notices at first. Observation from a distance. Messages that seem unusual but not alarming. Contact attempts that cross a boundary just slightly, then pull back, then cross it again a little further the next time. Each escalation tests the response. Each silence from the target registers as permission to go further. Psychologists who study this pattern describe a process called approach avoidance cycling. The fixated individual moves toward the subject, encounters a barrier, retreats temporarily, and then returns with a modified strategy. Each cycle brings them closer. Each barrier they overcome lowers the psychological cost of the next one. And over time, watching from a distance stops being enough. The need for proximity deepens. The fantasy of connection that has lived entirely inside one person's mind begins demanding something real to feed it. The passive becomes active. And one night, everything changes. James Fitzgerald pointed to a detail that everyone keeps returning to. No ransom note was left at Nancy's home the night she disappeared. Not one. In most ransom cases, communication begins immediately. A note. Instructions. A deadline. Something that establishes the terms and signals what the abductor wants. Here, there was nothing. The house was entered. Nancy was taken. And whoever did it left without a single word explaining why. The messages that appeared later, sent to media outlets and tied to Bitcoin demands, did not come from the person who took Nancy. Fitzgerald believes they were opportunists. People who saw a nationally known case generating daily headlines and inserted themselves into it, either for attention, for money, or simply because a case this visible makes a tempting stage. That is not unusual. High-profile disappearances routinely attract false communications. People who had nothing to do with the crime but want to be part of the story it has become. But if those messages were fabricated by outsiders, then the investigation spent weeks chasing a motive that was never real. And the actual motive was sitting somewhere else the entire time. If this was never about money, then the goal was never a ransom payment. The goal was Savannah looking into a camera and pleading for her mother's return. The moment she did that on national television, sitting across from Hoda Kotb with her voice breaking and her hands shaking, the person responsible got exactly what they had been building toward, possibly for years, before Nancy ever went missing. That changes the entire shape of this case. The Bitcoin trail failed. The FBI spent significant time attempting to trace the communications connected to those ransom messages. They followed the wallet addresses. They mapped the transaction chains. They worked with cryptocurrency analysts who specialize in exactly this kind of digital forensics. The trail went cold. For weeks, that looked like a dead end. An investigation that had arrived at a wall with no door in it. But Fitzgerald and Clemente read that failure differently. Whoever sent those messages understood digital anonymity at a level that is not common. They used tools and methods designed to obscure origin points and make tracing functionally impossible. Layered anonymization. Careful operational security. A deliberate architecture built to absorb investigative pressure without breaking. That is not the behavior of someone who woke up one morning and decided to commit a crime. It reflects preparation. Someone who planned not just the act itself, but the environment around it. Someone who thought through the aftermath before the event ever happened and built systems to survive scrutiny. And according to Fitzgerald, that level of pre-planning is entirely consistent with a long fixation-based escalation. Because someone who has spent months or years building toward a specific goal does not improvise the final execution. They plan it. They rehearse it mentally. They construct the pieces carefully and put them in place before the night they need them. The sophistication of the digital trail is not evidence of a professional criminal enterprise. It may be evidence of how long someone had to prepare. 30,000 tips. That is how many investigators have reportedly processed since Nancy disappeared. 30,000 people calling in, sending messages, forwarding photographs, trying to help find a woman none of them knew personally but who felt, in the way someone can feel after you have watched them on television for years, like someone you wanted to protect. And many of those leads have gone nowhere. Fitzgerald was direct about why. If this is a fixation-based crime, the answer never existed inside the broad public tip pool. The person responsible existed inside a much smaller orbit. Not a stranger to Savannah's world in the way her audience is a stranger to it. Someone who had inserted themselves or attempted to insert themselves into her professional life. Her media presence. The channels through which she receives public communication. What investigators need to revisit, according to Fitzgerald, is years of correspondence. Emails. Letters. Social media contact attempts flagged for unusual content. Direct messages that someone in a security role reviewed and categorized as low-level concern. Messages that seemed uncomfortable at the time but not dangerous enough to escalate. Because in fixation cases, there is almost always a paper trail, or a digital one. The fixated individual rarely maintains complete silence. They reach out, they test, they make contact in ways that seem oblique or harmless until you place them in sequence and understand what they were building toward. Somewhere inside that history is a pattern, a name, a moment when someone crossed a line that only now, in hindsight, looks like the beginning of all of this. Former FBI Assistant Director John Miller stated clearly that the person responsible is most likely local, someone who knows the Tucson area, someone who knew Nancy's neighborhood, understood the layout, understood the access points, and knew her daily routines well enough to plan around them. That specificity matters. Because it narrows the field considerably. This is not someone who flew in, acted, and disappeared. This is someone who lives inside the geography of this crime. Someone who may have driven those streets dozens of times before January 31st. Someone who may be watching the investigation unfold from close range right now. And then there is the man on the camera. The one seen moving through Nancy's property in the dark with deliberate, controlled movements. No hesitation at the edges, no pause to reorient. Movement that reads as familiar with the environment. Clemente and Fitzgerald do not believe he was the architect. He was the person carrying the plan out. The composure is real. But the execution contains inconsistencies in timing and decision-making that suggest he was operating inside a framework someone else built. Instructions he was following rather than improvising. A script written by a person who never intended to appear in the footage themselves. Someone who planned ahead. Someone who identified the target, studied the environment, built the complete framework, and then stepped back while someone else walked into frame. Someone who may never appear on camera at all. Someone who understood that the best way to reach Savannah Guthrie was not to go near Savannah Guthrie. It was to go near the one person she would do anything for. Before any profiler said any of this publicly, Savannah Guthrie already knew. She sat across from Hoda Kotb and she said it out loud, in front of millions of people, because the weight of it had become too heavy to carry quietly. She feared she had brought this to her mother's doorstep, and she was right to fear it. Not because she did anything wrong, not because being a public figure is an invitation to this kind of violation, but because someone out there made her visible life into a weapon against the private one she had worked to protect. Nancy Guthrie lived as far from the spotlight as possible, a quiet house, a garden, church on Sunday mornings, dinner with her daughter on Friday nights. A life built deliberately on the other side of everything Savannah's career represents. She did everything right, and none of it protected her, because being loved by the wrong person's obsession was enough. 3 months ago, Nancy left a family dinner and went home. She never made it to church the next morning. Her phone was still inside, her belongings were untouched, her garden was still waiting. And in the hours between those two moments, someone entered her home carrying a plan that investigators now believe had been years in the making. The question they still cannot publicly answer is whether Nancy recognized something in those final moments. A face. A voice. A name she had heard before in a context she could not immediately place. The answer may already exist somewhere, inside a message nobody has connected to the right question yet, inside a file that has not been pulled alongside the right name, inside a memory sitting with someone who has not yet understood what they are holding. When that connection finally happens, investigators believe it will not feel like a sudden discovery. It will feel like something that was always there. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 3 months. An 84-year-old woman who loved her family, her faith, and the quiet routines that made up her days. Someone out there knows something. A behavior that shifted after January 31st, a comment that landed strangely in the days before, an obsession that now, with everything you know, feels like something it did not feel like before. If that is you, this is the moment. FBI tip line 1800-CA-LL-FBI. Online tips.fbi.gov. Pima County Sheriff 520-351-4900. The reward stands at $1.2 million, but that is not why you call. You call because somewhere tonight, a woman who tended her garden and went to church and loved her daughter without reservation is still missing. Nancy Guthrie is not a headline. She is a mother, a grandmother, a woman of faith and Friday night dinners, and a garden that has been waiting 3 months for her to come home. She trusted the world around her. She deserved that trust to be honored. Subscribe, turn on every notification. Because when this case finally breaks, and investigators believe it will, nothing about it will look the way it looks right now.